Record. All right, very good. Well, welcome to the Double Your Groups This Fall webinar. My name is Alan White. For those who haven't met me, I have been a pastor for over 25 years. My wife Tiffany and I have been married for just over 16 years, and I have 4 kids, and I think these are the latest ages. They're all having birthdays now. I have a son who's 14, a son who is 10, a daughter who is 9, and youngest son is 2. I've coached over 1,500 churches in the last 11 years. In the last 5 years, I've helped churches start over 14,000 groups. And last year, the 18 churches that I worked with started right around 5,000 groups. I'm anxious to see. I've been working with about 25 churches so far this year, so I'm anxious to see where that number is going to go this year. Not that it's all about numbers, but I like to see that what I'm doing is actually going to be somewhat effective and helpful for people. And some of you that have been on the webinar before, this may be repetitious to you, so I apologize for that. What I do is I coach churches both individually and in groups. I've developed some online courses that are delivered either live or on demand. I have a book that's coming out in January, and I also blog over at alanwhite.org, and every Tuesday morning at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time, my post goes out. And I become pretty regimented about that, and that's when it happens. You can find me on Twitter at Alan White or Facebook.com/Alan White Consulting. All right, so why you haven't doubled groups yet this year. So I read through some of the things that people submitted as they were registering, but also went by some things that I kind of know and understand because I've been there. You don't have enough leaders. So if you don't have enough leaders, you're not going to double your groups. Your groups won't multiply, meaning that your groups aren't selfless enough to think of others and split up their group to help start new groups, and that's just the way it is. Your senior pastor isn't fully on board with groups, and so sometimes we get stuck on blaming our senior pastors, and there are other ways to start groups. You've used the same strategy for the last 3 years, and so if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, you may increase your results somewhat. But there is a place to add some additional strategies, not necessarily change your strategy, but add some additional strategies to what you're already doing. So let me tell you a little bit about how I doubled my groups. And some of the story is going to sound familiar to those of you who have been on a webinar before, but bear with me. When I started out in ministry, I went to a church in Northern California, and that church had to kind of have a rebirth a couple of years later. So the founding pastor left, a new pastor came in. We had 85 people. But, we learned some things and tried some things, learned a lot from Rick Warren and Saddleback Church. And our church began to grow by about 100 people a year. So it wasn't dramatic growth, but it was very consistent growth. When I left after 15 years, we were at about 1,500 on the weekend. So I saw as the church was growing, we needed to start groups. So we got to about 300, and we had the dynamic of, people went from I don't know everybody to I can't find the people that we know, especially when we went to 2 services and all of that. I knew that we needed to do something else. And as Rick Warren says, you need to grow the church larger and smaller at the same time. So larger, you want to reach out to your community and grow your weekend service, but smaller in the sense that everybody doesn't, can't know everybody, but at least everybody would know somebody. So we had a small group strategy that, within 5 years, we were going to meet or surpass the current growth of the church, and had all of that planned out, and got 7 years into my 5-year plan, and we were stuck. It did not go that well. Some years I'd start 10 groups, and some years I'd start 2 groups, and some years I would start no groups. So I went down to a conference in Orange County, California, and got some ideas, and driving back home I thought, well, how in the world are we going to implement those ideas in our church? And I began to think about what was on my pastor's heart at the time. And what he was thinking about, this was back in 2004, was the Passion of the Christ. And he'd already planned a sermon series around the Passion of the Christ. He'd already planned for some advertising. As I walked into his office, I said, Pastor Dave, what would you think about launching small groups around the Passion of the Christ? And he said, I think that's a great idea. Now, it was already his idea. So I've been an associate pastor for a long time. I'm no dummy. So I just hitchhiked on his idea and got it going. And so we actually made our own curriculum, output it to good old-fashioned VHS tape. This was back in the day. But here was the key to all of that. When he stood up on a Sunday morning and he said, we prepared these materials for you, And if you would be willing to open up your home and host a group, we'll help you get your group started. And we doubled our groups in a single day. Now, bear in mind, it had taken me 7 years to get to the place where we were. And then we doubled our groups in a day. I left that church, like I said, after 15 years. I went into church consulting, and then I arrived at a church here in the Greenville, South Carolina area called Brookwood Church, a little larger church, church of 6,500. And when I came in, there were about 120 groups. And in our first series that we did called Wrestling with God on the life of Jacob, we actually tripled our groups during that series and maintained a lot of those groups over the 4 years that I was there. And then I left there about 5 years ago to go back into consulting. Let me tell you about one of the churches that I worked with about 5 years ago is Van Dyke Church, which is down in the Tampa, Florida area, great United Methodist church. This was a church of 1,800 adults. And when I first met them, they had 400 of their adults in groups and had been doing a lot of things of handpicking leaders, and groups were doing various kinds of curriculum. They hadn't done anything in the way of alignment or anything else at that point. We actually coached them on producing their own curriculum and tried out some different strategies for getting people into groups. The first time out in the fall of 2011, they did a series called Q&A, Questions and Answers, and they went from having 400 adults in groups to having about 1,000 adults in groups. And then in the new year of 2012, these guys were animals. They produced another series that was called Shouting at Jesus. And in January of 2012, they went from 1,000 adults in groups to 1,600 in groups. And then in their third series, which was called Master Plan, they launched after Easter in 2012. They got to a place where they were actually had over 2,000 of their adults in groups in a church of 1,800. And there's something to be said with the sequence of that. There's something to be said with producing curriculum in some form or fashion. But their immediate result was to go from 400 groups to 1,000 in groups, which was far more than double. So let's get into some of the principles for potentially doubling your groups this fall. The first principle is this: you want to choose the right topic. I've worked with a lot of churches over the years, and a lot of churches have very different ideas of how they want to go about launching groups. And some topics are very, appealing to a wide variety of people. Other topics are a little more mature and maybe are a little more of kind of that insider church family kinds of topics. And that's not to say that any of these topics I'm going to mention are unimportant. It's just that if your purpose is to double your groups, you really want to think carefully about where you're going to go with your topic. So I had one church, they said, we start our year every year with a 21-day fast, and so we're going to launch groups with a curriculum on fasting. And I said, the good news is the snacks are going to be really easy. But the other part of it is that, it's going to be a little more challenging, especially for people that are new to your church, people that are not part of your church, people that are not believers. This might be a little bit of a tougher topic. Another topic that may be a challenge is maybe something to do with giving or tithing or money. Why? Because everybody assumes that the church only wants your money. Now, what they don't think about is Amazon only wants your money. The shopping mall only wants your money. But for some reason, when the church only wants your money, that becomes a problem. So any kind of curriculum that has anything to do with money, or especially a capital campaign, is not a great way to get the most people you possibly can into groups. I had another church, and they said, well, we want to do a series to teach our people how to do evangelism. And I thought, evangelism is right up there with, public speaking and, death and all those greatest fears. I thought, man, that's going to be a hard one to get people involved in. And so with the church, I challenged them. I said, maybe instead of making the curriculum about evangelism, what if we made the curriculum evangelistic? In that we share stories of changed lives. We have the message of the gospel in the curriculum. People invite their friends, their neighbors, their coworkers to come and be involved in the group. And it's maybe a gentler approach to this instead of just teaching people how to do evangelism, and obviously has a very different appeal. So over the years, there have been some campaigns that have been fantastic. I mean, you can't top 40 Days of Purpose, The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. Some 30 or 40,000 churches have gone through 40 Days of Purpose. And that was a great way to get people connected into groups. Other things, Kerry Shook did 1 Month to Live a few years ago. Gene Apple did a series he launched on Easter a few years ago called Hope Rising. And Gene's church in Anaheim, California is about 7,000 on the weekend. They handed a copy of the study guide to every person that attended service on Easter, and they started 460 groups after Easter that year. One church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania did a series called Monsters Under the Bed. I'll talk to you a little bit more about them. A church down in Warner Robins, Georgia did one on legacy called Hand-Me-Downs. And then there's a church in the Indianapolis area that did a series called Family Matters, a little bit of a dated title, but things about relationships, about marriage, about family, about parenting, all very common topics and felt needs. So the right topic will help your church reach your community. So think about the things that are felt needs in your community, or things that people need in general. People need hope. They need love. They need, quite a variety of things. They need to overcome fears. And so think about a topic that would reach a lot of people: how to deal with your stress, how to balance your life. And this is not in any way to, water down the gospel, but to present it in such a way that it broadens the appeal. I had one church a couple of years ago that they were launching groups on with Francis Chan's Multiply, which I love Francis Chan. I got to be honest with you. When I read Francis Chan, I reflect and I think, I don't know, am I really a Christian? But anyway, I love Francis Chan and the part that he plays in the body of Christ. But Multiply was kind of an intense sort of curriculum, especially to be launching a lot of groups. So this church already had about 120 groups. They announced Multiply. They recruited 3 weeks for Multiply. They had briefings after 3 services for 3 weeks for Multiply. And out of their 120 groups, 25 groups signed up to do Multiply. Now, we were coaching them, so I thought, we're in trouble. And we actually, connected with the senior pastor, let him know the situation, told him he needed to get up on Sunday, swing for the fences, and based on his authority and his ability to persuade, they ended up with 175 groups doing Multiply. But it was a rough road. And then their follow-up curriculum was Dave Ramsey's Momentum. Again, a stellar program. You can't beat Dave Ramsey when it comes to finances, but they were just such hard topics. So the next fall, when we started working with them, they chose a much broader topic. In fact, the name of it was Home Run. It was kind of about how to win in life and, these sorts of things. Well, since they had paid the price the year before with such tough topics, the Home Run was a much easier one to promote and get people involved in. And they just had an astronomical, number of groups, and it was much easier. And it all came down to what topic they were studying. Now, don't tell Francis Chan that I was saying anything negative about him, because, he'll send a hitman after me, and I don't want to do that. So, okay, I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions. And in the chat window there's a chat box. You could type in a message. And so what I want to hear from you is this. First of all, how many groups would it take for you to double your current number of groups this fall? Now, this is not a trick question, because double what you have now would actually be the number of groups that you have now, right? So go ahead in the chat window, type in the number of groups or your goal for this fall. All right, so Frank says 13. Doug says 20. All right, anybody else? We have one other. I don't want to skip you. All right. Okay, so we got that in mind. Now here's the next question. How many people would you need to start that many groups? How many people would you need to start the number of groups that you just stated? You can go ahead and answer in the chat window. All right, so I had a response from Nick. And so Nick says 15 to 20, he already has 35. Okay. So then Doug says to start 20, he would need 26. Frank says he would need 13 leaders plus 4 to 5 coaches. Okay, so you guys are thinking in the right direction because I didn't always used to think this way. Here's what I used to think. I used to think that if you needed 20 groups, then you needed about 200 people. So roughly 10 people in a group, 20 times 10 is 200. However, what I think now is this, that if you need 20 groups, then you need about 20 leaders. And if some of those are couples, then you would have ultimately more leaders. But you really have to think in terms of how many people that you have that are willing to lead or willing to give group leadership a try and focus on leaders. So let's go to principle number 2. You want to lower the bar on leadership, not permanently, but at least temporarily. So some people you think, well, what are your qualifications for leadership? Well, you need a seminary grad or the next Billy Graham, the next Mother Teresa, maybe Jesus Jr. I love this quote from Neil Cole where he says this: we need to lower the bar on what it means to be a leader and raise the bar on what it means to be a disciple. I love this quote. We need to lower the bar on what it means to be a leader and raise the bar on what it means to be a disciple. So we need to provide an easier entry point to help people get started in groups. And maybe it's just a temporary assignment. And so one of the things we've learned from church-wide campaigns that you give them a 6-week trial run and they get the sense of, is this something that I want to do for 6 weeks? And for some churches, they may need to be a member to do that. One church I talked to recently, I said, well, what was your qualification? Well, as long as they were breathing, as long as they were willing, we would take them. And if your church is ready to go there, it's great to go there. So a few years ago, I was working with Dr. Tony Evans and Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, and they had a very, very high standard for leadership. They did require, they called them hosts, they did require all of the new hosts to be members of the church. So we had to figure that out first. And then we ran into a problem. Dr. Evans was already behind this idea of people hosting a group for 6 weeks, kind of seeing how it would go, reevaluate, and then, encourage them on further. But their 175 groups they already had weren't really sure about, they thought, well, this is going to create a mess. This is going to, because they had a very high standard for leadership. I think they had a year of leadership training, if my memory serves me right. So I'm on a conference call with their small group leadership team, which was their staff, and they said, we're talking to our existing leaders. They're saying that they think if you just let anybody in, that it's going to cause a lot of problems. There's going to be a big mess. There's not going to be the quality of groups and all of that. Well, I could read between the lines. And what I was reading between the lines was that what they were saying was, hey, listen, we paid our dues, and now you're just going to let anybody in? And so I thought, Lord, I need something to tell them. Please help me. One of those quick prayers. And so when they were done kind of rehearsing all of this that they had heard from their leaders, I said, this isn't a call to leadership. This is a call to obedience, because we are all called to go and make disciples. And it got very quiet on the other end of the line. And I thought, man, I've killed this thing. I'm in trouble. And somebody spoke up and they said, could you repeat that? And so I did. And from that point on, we were good as far as who we were going after and why we were going after them. And so Dr. Evans a few years ago preached a beautiful message on community on Labor Day weekend, which is not the weekend that I would recommend, but Dr. Evans is going to do what he does. And so he preached this message on community on Labor Day weekend, and 260 people filled out a card saying that they wanted to host a group. And at the end of 3 weeks of recruiting, they had 500 people that said, I would like to lead one of these groups. And the difference was we weren't looking for these highly qualified, highly trained leaders. We were looking for people that were willing to gather a group of friends or open up their home and were willing to be obedient. Now, we didn't say who's going to be obedient to follow the Great Commission, because that would have been just as scary as asking them to lead. But a lot of times when you ask people, would you like to lead a group? Most people don't see themselves as leaders. Or, I'm not a leader, I'm not a teacher, I can't do this sort of thing. And so if you say, would you just get together with some folks for 6 weeks and host a group? Or would you get together with some friends and do the study together? And it's a trial run. Think about when you buy a car. When you go to buy a car, usually you test drive that car. And the qualification to test drive the car is that you would have a driver's license. Now, Frank, I don't know how they do this in Poland, but this is how they do this in the U.S. So you have a driver's license, they let you test drive the car, and then if you want to take the car home, then you have to fill out a whole bunch of paperwork, and you own the car, and you take the car home. And so for a lot of people, when we sign them up into small group leadership, we have them do a lot of things. We have them fill out a lot of paperwork, if you will, just to get started in the small group. And we didn't even give them a test drive to see if leading a small group was their thing or not. And so to me, to get a bunch of people started, to at least test this out, give them an opportunity to continue as a group, and to see whether or not, this is something that they feel gifted and called to do, then we come back and say, if you'd like to be an official group, here are some things that we would like, some steps we'd like to follow on the leadership track to make your group official. And if you don't want to be official, you know what? That's okay. That's where you guys are right now. But an easier entry point will help people self-select as leaders for 6 weeks. And to me, the risk in this is simply whether the groups are advertised or whether the groups are not advertised. If you're going to advertise the groups in a small group directory or on a website, or send people to the groups or have them available for some sort of small group connection event, then you had better know the people that you're sending these potential group members to. You better know something about them and all of that. However, if people are doing a study with their friends and you don't advertise those groups, you can certainly be far more lenient and relax the qualifications, because they're inviting people that they already know. So there really shouldn't be a lot of surprises in those instances. And so sometimes not advertising groups can give people that trial run, and then when they get to the point where they feel like, I want our group to be official, then we give them a process to become official. Principle number 3 is this: focus on recruiting leaders. So if your pastor is going to give you any kind of airtime on Sunday morning where the senior pastor is going to talk about groups, you don't, let's say the pastor says, over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to promote groups. So week number 1, we're going to recruit leaders, and week number 2, we're going to get people into groups. No, that's not what we're going to do. Because here's the thing: if you have a bunch of people, you may or may not have a group. And I know there are some strategies that you throw a bunch of people in the room and try to create groups and appoint the leader on the spot and all of that. To be honest with you, I don't feel great about strategies like that. Also, you don't want to promote every group or class in the church. You want to promote specifically for leaders to lead a group for a 6-week series. Maybe that's aligned with a sermon, maybe that's not. But let's just face it, there are a lot of things that are working for smaller segments of our congregation that, like Sunday school, like Bible study, like Women Addicted to Beth Moore, all of that stuff. And you need to allow those things to work with those groups. Everybody does not have to be studying the exact same thing all the time. However, for the most part, traditional classes, Sunday school, these sorts of things are declining. There are some exceptions. I have a friend of mine that would love to have small groups. 90% of his church are in Sunday school. Sunday school is serving them well. There's no place for small groups in his church. So I just have to tell him, you know what, don't worry about it, because you're doing great with what Sunday school is doing. But that's a very rare exception. So promoting all of this other stuff, you really want to clear the deck. And you want to promote groups, and you don't want to recruit anybody who's there. You want to recruit leaders. If the pastor gives you 1 week to talk about groups, or he's going to talk about groups, have them recruit leaders. If the pastor is going to give you 2 weeks where he's going to say something about groups, have him recruit leaders. If the pastor is going to give you 3 weeks to recruit or say something about groups, have him recruit leaders, because in recruiting leaders, other people in the church will figure out that groups are happening and here's the topic, and they'll become interested in joining groups. But you want to use that precious airtime that we have on Sunday morning to recruit leaders, especially if the senior pastor is giving that, because the senior pastor will get a far better result than any of us would ever hope to. In fact, back in 2004, when my pastor stood up and recruited leaders for the Passion of the Christ series, and we doubled our groups in a day, ever since then, I have not recruited a single small group leader. In 12 years, I haven't recruited one leader. And so I served a few more years at that church. I served 4 years at the church here in South Carolina. And I never recruited a group leader for the church here in South Carolina because I knew the impact it would have if the senior pastor, who is the founding pastor, stood up on the Sunday and said, hey, we're going to do this series, and I want you to get together with some friends, or would you open your home? That he would have a far greater impact than I would. Because first of all, I don't sound like I'm South Carolina. Second of all, people didn't really even know me. I had no credibility. So I had to depend on my senior pastor's credibility. And of course, being the founder, he had credibility to boot. And we actually tripled our groups on the first series that we did. All right. So there are some exceptions here. But what if people can't find a group? Or what if people are new? Or what if they need a group every Tuesday night in the 29860 zip code that meets at midnight? Or what if they have no friends? Here's what my best advice. Let the exceptions be the exceptions. Don't build an entire system on the exceptions. See how many people that these leaders that your pastor recruited, see how many people these leaders will invite to groups, and then provide some way for people to meet face-to-face and get connected into a group. If you love sign-up cards and placing people into groups, I'm going to tell you 2 things you already know. The first is you're wasting your time. The second is it's an ineffective strategy. So I would encourage you to get out of that business and spend your time and effort creating an environment where prospective group members can meet the leaders and sign up to be in their group. But by placing people into groups and web sign-up forms and all of that stuff, it doesn't work very well, and it takes a lot of effort. And if you disagree with me, you can disagree with me. If you agree with me, then I encourage that. All right, so you want to focus on recruiting leaders because members will find their way. All right, principle number 4 is this. You want to recruit a month prior to your launch. So why do you want to recruit for a month? First of all, you want to meet with your current leaders first, and you want to let them know what's coming up. You want to let them know that if they're already committed to doing something in the fall, then they are more than welcome to do what they've already committed to in the fall or what they've already planned. Because one thing I've learned with established leaders is you really want to do things by invitation. You don't want to make things mandatory. I mean, I live in a state that has no helmet law, and so you don't make anything mandatory here. And the other thing is sometimes by requiring people to do things, they'll just get stubborn and dig in because you told them they had to do it. Whereas if you invited the same people, they would be more than happy to take you up on the invitation. So why fight it? Here's the other thing, is that your focus needs to be on how many new groups you can start, how many new leaders you can recruit and train and get ready for your fall launch. So I'll state this in an extreme way. Because your focus should be on the new leaders, I don't really care what your established leaders do. Because you already have your established leaders in your established groups. So you don't need to worry about them so much. And what if they don't want to do the church-wide campaign? Well, as long as they're not talking bad about the pastor or worshiping the devil, just give them permission to do whatever they want. They don't have to be on the same page as everybody else. You already have them. You want to put your energy on the new one. The other reason you recruit for a month is not everyone attends every Sunday. The average person in America attends church 1.6 Sundays a month. And I don't know how they came up with a statistic like that, but that's the average. So if you only recruit once or twice, they may not even be there on the Sunday when you're talking about it. So you want to recruit at least for 3 Sundays in a row. Also, people may need more than 1 week to decide. If you give them 1 week and you announce it in the service, well, some people you've caught them flat-footed and they haven't heard about this before. They can't make a decision in the day, and so the easiest decision that they can make is no. But if you talk about it the first week and it puts it in their minds, and then the second week you invite them again, then they might say yes now that they've had a little bit of time to think about it, to talk it over with their spouse. So let me tell you about 2 churches that I worked with. One was in New York City. They recruited for 1 week. They had 20 new groups, and they were disappointed. And then there was a church in Florida, and they recruited for 3 weeks. And they started 60 new groups, and they were overjoyed. And here's the interesting thing. The Florida church also had 20 new groups after they had recruited for 1 week. So that doesn't always mean that your total is going to be triple what your first week was, but it certainly was in this case. I mean, these were churches, I was coaching them both, I was giving them both the same material, the same information. The New Yorkers decided they only wanted to recruit for a week, they got 20. The Florida church went ahead and recruited for 3 weeks, they got 60. And I would dare say that if the New York church had recruited for a couple more weeks, they might have been closer to 62. So you catch more people and you want to give them time to make a decision. All right, let's go to insight number 5. Your senior pastor must be your church's small group champion. Now, here's the way you don't do that. You don't do that by going to him and saying, listen, I was listening to this guy on this webinar, and he said the only way that we're going to double our groups this fall is if you, senior pastor, would be our small group champion. And if you're not willing to do that, there's no chance that we're going to get this many. You don't want to approach it like that. So how do you get your senior pastor to be your small group champion? Well, one way to do that is to put your pastor on the curriculum, because your pastor will be more interested in the curriculum if it has his teaching on it. So case in point is this church, Van Dyke Church in the Tampa, Florida area. So Pastor Matthew Hartsfield, we shoot the curriculum with him, coached his team did all the video. And the next morning he pulls us into his office and he says, now, we've shot this video and we're creating this curriculum. Now, how do we recruit leaders and how are we going to get people connected into groups? His discipleship pastor pulled me aside later in the day and he said, listen, I've been trying to get my pastor interested in small groups for 2 years. He said, and you just did it. And I just smiled at him and said, well, I'm Alan White. No, I actually did not say that. But the reason that the senior pastor was very interested in the groups now is because the senior pastor made the investment of developing curriculum. And while this is work and you can hire places, and I can make some recommendations if you want to do that, or, you know, I coach churches on how to develop their own materials. There are ways to do this. And if the pastor makes this investment, and it's not too late for this year to do this, then the pastor will be more motivated. But here's the other thing. Your people will be more interested in the curriculum if your pastor's on it. Because let's face it, other than Jesus Christ, the people who are not connected in your church attend your church because of your senior pastor. They like his personality, they like his style, they laugh at his jokes. Now, don't mention this to your worship pastor because it'll break his heart. But people are there because they like your pastor. So when the pastor stands up and said, we've developed these materials based on my teaching, well, now you're giving your people more of what they already like. And then your pastor says, I'd like to invite you to open up your homes and start a group, or I'd like to invite you to get together with your friends and do this study. Well, they're going to follow their pastor's lead. And like I said, I haven't recruited a single small group leader in 12 years. The other way to get your senior pastor involved is to give him some research about the benefits of groups. So what do senior pastors worry about? They worry about things like attendance, spiritual growth, closing the back door, outreach, finances. And I could tell you a bunch of stories about how small groups meet all of these needs, but instead of doing that, I'm going to give you a little bit of research. So 2 books, one's more recent, is Transformational Groups by Ed Stetzer and Eric Geiger. The other is a researcher from Princeton University, Robert Wuthnow, wrote a book called Sharing the Journey. And what these books tell us is that the small groups will increase connection in your church, which we know, and this helps to solve the assimilation issue. It also increases spiritual growth because people are taking time to intentionally focus on their relationship with God, their knowledge of Scripture, living it out. And so this meets the discipleship need. Studies have also shown that groups will increase attendance in 2 ways. One is that if you're doing an aligned curriculum where the sermon series goes along with the small group study, people will attend more consistently on the weekend because they know that the sermon on the weekend has something to do with their small group study. The second thing that happens, and I wish I could say I was smart enough to figure this out, but it just happened, but I'll take credit because I'm reporting it, is that when we began to create curriculum with our pastor on the video, people would invite their friends to their groups, and some of these friends had never been to our church before. And so over the course of the series, they were introduced to our pastor in the comfort of their friend's living room, watching our pastor on video. And then when they were invited to come to church, they felt like they already knew our pastor because they had spent 6 weeks at their friend's house watching him on video. People who are in groups tend to serve more than people who are not in groups. In fact, one church I'm working with recently, that 73% of people in groups increased their serving, and being a member of a group also increases your giving. The research from Transformational Groups with Stetzer and Geiger is that a person in a group will give a little more than 4% annually, will give 4% more than people who are not in groups. So let's say if the salary is $35,000. Well, 4% of $35,000 is about $1,400 for one family, one giving unit, whatever you want to say it, in your church. So now I will tell you a story. I was working with a church a couple years ago in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area, and they did a series in the new year, and then they did a series after Easter, and created their own curriculum. Their pastor was on the video, invited people to do groups. And then they went back and compared the first 6 months of 2015 to the first 6 months of 2014. And what they discovered was that their attendance, their weekend attendance had increased by 7.5%, and their giving had increased by 7%. And the only thing that they did differently in 2015 over the previous year was that they did the 2 aligned series and connected their people into groups. And I hear story after story. Mariners Church that I'm working with out in California, the people that go through the Rooted series, 84% increase their giving in some form or fashion. If they tithe, they give more than a tithe. If they aren't giving, they start giving. And it's really a pretty amazing phenomena. Let me tell you about a couple other churches I've worked with. This is Pastor Troy Jones. He's senior pastor of New Life Center in Renton, Washington, the Great Assemblies of God Church. And they're a church of 2,500. When I met them last year, they had 100 groups. We helped them produce curriculum. We added some new strategies for recruiting leaders and connecting people into groups. And we added 400 new groups over 2 series we did in the beginning of the year last year. So now we have a church of 2,500 adults with 500 groups. And Pastor Troy caught the vision for reaching out to the community through small groups. And I don't know about you guys, but Washington State is not the easiest place to have a church or to do evangelism. But they found the effectiveness of reaching their community through groups that now their goal is to have 1,000 groups in a church of 2,500. Atonement Lutheran Church is an evangelical Lutheran church in America, ELCA, there we go, in Barrington, Illinois. It's a church of 300 adults. And they did, the first year I met them about 2 years ago, they did what we called a Year of Transformation, which was a 3-part series. They did one 6-week study in the fall, one in the new year, one after Easter. They distributed 580 copies of their study guide in a church of 300 adults. And this church is, I mean, literally right around the corner from Willow Creek. Then they did a 2nd-year curriculum, and actually the now, I should update the slide, is that I'm working with them to help develop their 3rd year of curriculum, that they are actually doing all the work to develop the curriculum, and I'm kind of coaching them and guiding them through. But the coolest thing about this church is when they went from the fall series to the New Year series in the first year, they only lost one group, but the overall group membership actually increased, which we found to be pretty amazing. Lastly, this is my friend Charlie Holt. He's at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Orlando, Florida. Church of 260 adults when I first met him about a decade ago. And they started 75 groups for the 40 Days of Purpose. So you have a church of 260 adults that had, give or take, 750 people involved in 40 Days of Purpose because people were inviting their friends, their neighbors. A couple years ago, he developed a series called the Christian Life Trilogy, and he's actually had over 100 other churches participate in that series. So your senior pastor is the leader, and you want to let your senior pastor take the lead in recruiting group leaders. Okay, so let's talk about maybe how I could help your church double your groups this fall. And if you stick with me to the end here, and this isn't going to take more than a few minutes, I will give you 30 minutes of my coaching. So I'll give you a link to my schedule, and you can pick out a time, and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. But here's what I'd like to talk to you about. I'm doing a few things leading up to the fall over the summer. And so what I'd like to talk about today is a 6-week live course that I'm going to do online over GoToMeeting like this, called Double Your Groups this fall. And so what we're going to cover is, what series to use, developing your coaching structure, recruiting new group leaders. Because if you're going to double your group leaders, then you got to double your coaches. So Frank was already on it there saying you needed 13 leaders and 4 or 5 coaches. How to form groups that will last. I mean, we all know if we've done any kind of church-wide campaigns that you can create a lot of excitement, get a lot of groups started for 6 weeks. But if you don't have a plan, and if you haven't formed the groups correctly at the beginning, then after 6 weeks, that thing is just going to fall off the cliff. What to measure and monitor, how to sustain groups into the new year, that's a big one there. So the course is going to be this, 6 live conference calls. It's going to run July 13th through August 17th. We're going to do it on Wednesdays, 1:30 Eastern, 10:30 Pacific. About 45 minutes of instruction, about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, and then I'll give you downloadable timelines and templates that you can use for your launch. That way you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can take something that I did for a briefing and turn it into your own briefing packet, or a timeline of what you need to do every week from now until your fall launch, and then through that going into what's going to happen in the new year. So just very quickly, how much does this cost? I've coached churches for a very long time, and I worked for 7 of the last 11 years with Brett Eastman at Life Together, and the churches that we coached paid anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 a month for a 12-month commitment. I work for myself now. I am a one-man band. I don't have the overhead of a big organization, so I don't have to charge those kind of prices. So the 6-week course, first option would be the 6-week course, live course, is $497. It would be recorded, and you could review it anytime you wanted. Some people say, well, it's okay to have the information, but we want to talk about it too. So if you want to do the course, maybe add a couple of one-on-ones, that would go up a little bit to $797. The third option would be the course, the 2 one-on-one consultations, and then an assessment where we would collect some data from your church, and then I would I would show you the data and what we're learning from it, kind of how to target who and that sort of thing. And that's a little higher. It's about $500 more. The reality is when I do just the assessment with the church and I fly out to their place and do a presentation and all of that, that assessment is $2,500. And then the fourth option is I have a 6-month coaching group that's actually starting next week, and it's going to have 2 group calls and 1 individual call every month and a bunch of other stuff, and that runs for $1,497. So if you're interested in any of that, you can get more information by going over to my website, which is alanwhite.org/double. And if you're interested in any of those options, you can sign up there and pay with your credit card or PayPal, and we can get started. And just to give you a little incentive, if you decide you want to do this in the next 24 hours, I'll give you another one-on-one consultation. So that's that. All right, so now I'm going to open it up for questions. I know I've kind of done fire hose to face today, but we'll open it up for questions, and you can either, if you have a microphone, you can feel free to speak your question. My big microphone in front of me, I'm going to move out of my way. When you grow up in Kansas and you have this like non-accent thing, you do whatever it takes to make you sound better. But anyway, but I'll just take, I've got about 10, 15 minutes. Any questions, thoughts, arguments? Would any of this work in your church? We're not specifically asking about the coaching, but if you have questions about that, we can talk as well.
Alan, I have a question. I was wondering, I understand the idea of creating so many groups quickly, you know, doubling your groups and doing this host strategy, creating your curriculum, all those kinds of things.
Yes.
And I see that as important, vital, necessary, all those things. But do you see a level of quality in those groups that is maybe a little bit less, you know, less quality than maybe some really good groups that are going on there? Or maybe does Darwinism kind of factor into that those groups that are created, the strong survive, and those keep on going, and you're okay with that? Could you maybe talk about the quality of this strategy, the quality of the groups?
Yeah, I could go a couple ways. I'll take the easy road instead of how God dealt with me on the quality thing. When we did this, we ran back-to-back campaigns for 18 months at our church in California. And in that time, we went from having 30% of our adults participating in groups to having nearly 40% of our adults lead a 6-week study at least one time.
Okay.
But when it all shook out of that 40%, some of them discovered it was their thing. Some of them discovered it was not their thing. And what ultimately happened was we had 13% of our adults leading groups. Now, some of them may not have had great experiences. Okay. Honestly, I didn't have a ton of complaints. But it really is the thing, as you said, Darwinian, is that if a person has the stuff that it takes to gather that group and to lead them for 6 weeks, then more than likely they'll continue on to another series and eventually become an official group. If it wasn't great for them, if it was okay for them, but it's not something they really feel gifted and called to do, then you know what? We thank them for giving it a try and then begin to work toward, you know, pointing them to some other area of ministry. But for us, it really took engaging 40% of our adults in leadership over those 18 months to get to 13%. Whereas before, you know, we had, now I got to do math in my head, which I can't do, so I'll get out my calculator. When we started, we were at, calculator would say calculator, wouldn't it? I'm on the wrong page. Okay, so we had 4%, actually 3.75% of our adults were leading groups. And we had 30% of our adults in groups, and we were stuck. And that was after 7 years of work. And then to go from that to having 13% of our groups leading, or 13% of our members leading groups, and 125% of our average adult attendance connected into a group within 12 months. 18 months. So it had taken 7 years to get to 3 0.75% leading and 30% in groups. And it took 18 months to get to 13% consistently leading and 125% of our adults in groups. So that's why I'm a big fan of this strategy. And granted, there are a few people, they pick an odd night of the week. Like, I don't know about you guys. I've never had a group that's effectively met on a Saturday night. Sunday through Friday are great, but Saturday night, so these people chose Saturday night. They were in the next county, kind of in a remote rural area, and nobody signed up to be part of the group. And that was kind of a little bit of a heartbreak. They were kind of hanging their heads as they're leaving the connection event. But on the other side of it, they didn't take the initiative to invite anybody either. So when it's very clear that somebody doesn't have the stuff or they're working hard to make it work because they made a commitment, but it's not their thing, then you just kind of graciously let them bow out and then try to get them into something else, if that makes sense.
Okay. Do you find that some of those people who bow out are actually more excited about being in a group and not leading a group, and maybe they find one and that's a better fit for them?
Yeah, I think for some people it's very definitely the case. I mean, by my own admission, I'm not a great group leader. I do okay at coaching churches, but I'm not I'd rather be in a group than lead a group because I'm just not, I'm not great at leading a group. And I've done it. I have a group I started, 8-9 years ago. It's still meeting. I'm not the leader anymore, but yeah. Any other questions or thoughts?
I have more questions, but I want to leave it open to other people.
All right. I think Nick had to jump off. Frank, any questions on your side?
Yeah, maybe one question. I was listening to the point you made concerning offering to the people to take up the temporary leadership for like the 6 weeks period.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, maybe taking it into account our environment or in environment, it's hard for me to imagine that I could be successful in recruiting people in that way, like asking on a Sunday service the people I understand promoting the group, but I'm asking the people or recruit the leaders on Sunday sounds for me pretty hard. So I'm looking for a more one-to-one ways of selecting the right people to raise their interest in trying to do it for a small period of time.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I was there too at one point. I think that my thought is this: that it's difficult to recruit people one-on-one. It's possible, but it's difficult, at least in my experience. And so again, because a lot of people don't consider themselves to be leaders of any kind. And so when you ask, would you like to lead a group? No, I'm not a leader. However, probably the best compliment I was ever paid was when one of these non-leaders told me at one point, because he'd given a trial run at a group, and he eventually became part of my small group team. And what he told me as I was leaving the church was, he said, "Thank you for showing me that I was the leader that I never knew that I was." Because people have influence, they have the ability to lead, and so the idea of influence is they can invite people to be part of a group. But the other thing too is just because they want to lead. I mean, if you have like a big announcement from your pastor, if you'd like to lead a group, that doesn't mean that you necessarily tell them yes. All of the leaders, that I had recruited that way, I made sure that they had a coach, that they had somebody with experience that walked alongside with them during the series that was getting to know them. The other thing is we offered training. And training is changing a little bit as far as how you deliver it, but we offered them all training as they went. But also when we made anybody public as a leader, we were going to advertise them in any way, or they were going to participate in some kind of a small group connection. We actually had them fill out a little application. And the last question on the application was to the effect of, is there anything going on in your life that would harm the church or the cause of Christ. And some people, they simply wouldn't answer the question. They wouldn't turn their application in. They more or less just kind of took their name out of it. I did have some interesting conversations with people who were living together, but they weren't married. They didn't see how that was going to harm or embarrass the church or the cause of Christ. So I had to be a little more specific about people that were going through separation or divorce, people that were having, a sexual relationship outside of marriage, people that were struggling with a life-controlling problem. And if, those things came up, I sat down and would just have a pastoral conversation with them and say, now, here are some ways that the church can help you. But I don't think small group leadership is going to be the right thing for you right now. You might want to consider joining a group. And then later on, we can come back and revisit this. But right now, we want to focus on what's going on with you and not necessarily, what you can do for the church. Because I wanted them to be concerned about, how the church could help them and focus on what was going on in their life. So, yeah, there were a lot of times that people wanted to lead, and we just had to pull them aside and say, listen, we need to talk about this. Now, if the groups weren't advertised, we were a little more flexible there in that we didn't know quite as much about them, but they were doing all of the inviting, and they were inviting people that they already knew and people who already knew them. So it wasn't as risky in a way. We still gave them a coach. We still gave them training and treated them on the same process, but we didn't advertise them in any way, and that gave us a little bit of a break there. Does that help at all? Or
good point. Yes, thank you.
I was with one church down in Sarasota a couple months back, and they're large. They're 8,000 on the weekend, and they're still handpicking leaders. And it takes a lot of effort. I mean, just even to meet people, to know. I mean, obviously you can pray and God will send people to you, but it was just a lot of work. And I said, well, at least this way, if you do some kind of a 6-week trial run, you can still handpick the ones that you want to have continue. But instead of fishing out of the ocean, now you're fishing out of a pond. And so you've had an experience of whether or not these people have the stuff, to lead a group that you want to invite them to continue, as opposed to looking at this huge congregation of 8,000 people wondering, okay, Lord, who do I even ask? And that's a good problem to have, but it was a significant problem for them.
Thanks a lot.
Sure. All right, I got another minute or two here. Any other thoughts or questions?
Alan, how do you count how many people are in these host groups? If it's a person that just comes in, gets the curriculum, invites some friends in their house, how do you get a total number that's pretty accurate?
The best way to do it is to use a database like Church Teams that'll send out a request for information every time they meet. So Church Teams to me is the best database there is, and I can tell you all the problems I have with a lot of other databases, but I won't go into that.
What is it called again, one more time?
It's called Church Teams. It's at churchteams.com, and you can they have webinars every week. You can download a 30-day free trial. My friend Boyd Pelly is the founder of Church Teams, but I like it because it was created by a small group pastor and not a software engineer that is trying to figure out how to create something to inflict on the church. But they've expanded it since I used it, where it'll do everything that Fellowship One will do. It'll just cost you a lot less money, and it's all web-based. So that's one way to go, is something like Church Teams. The second way to go is about the third week into the series, send a survey out to everyone that is doing a group and ask them in one of the questions to list the names of everyone who's participated in the group so far. So at least you can have some kind of a head count. I mean, if push comes to shove, they don't fill out the survey, you don't have the information, then you can actually ask your coaches to try to get that information. But I don't like to put coaches in that position of gathering information, because I want the coach to focus on building the relationship with that leader. But now one of those ways should get you some kinds of numbers, because you do want to know that you've been successful in it, and not oh, well, that was a lot of fun and we don't really know what happened, that's not a very good place to be.
Are you giving coaches to these brand new host leaders that have never,
I
they
do.
already getting it?
I do. But the way I do it is because I know that I need to increase my coaches if I'm going to increase the overall number of groups and leaders. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll challenge an experienced leader to walk alongside the new leader for the 6 weeks of the study. And so what I'm doing is just like we're giving that new leader a 6-week trial at what it's like to be a group leader, I'm giving that coach, that experienced leader, a 6-week trial at what it's like to be a coach.
Oh, wow.
And then we evaluate at the end of that and decide, is this something that they would like to continue? Were they successful at it? And then let's give them more. And if they didn't like doing it or they weren't good at it or none of the groups that they coached actually survived, then we thank them very much for 6 weeks of their valuable time. You've now fulfilled your commitment. Don't call us. We'll call you. But again, it's just a matter of giving them a trial run to see whether or not they've got the stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. I need to jump in a minute, but any last question or thoughts?
I got one last question for you. How many strategies do you implement in a year? So the host strategy would be one, but I'm sure you must try and put other strategies in there. Just a quick number. How many different strategies do you think you add in a calendar year?
When we got to 125% in groups, we were actually using 5 strategies at the same time.
Okay.
Now, one of the strategies was leaving our established groups alone and letting people join those groups whether or not they were part of the campaign. And we would roll them out in different ways because we were still heavy on host. We would roll out host as the first option, and then we would roll out doing the study with your friends or starting a group on your own as a later option, and then broke it down a little further from there. And so, and some of it worked really well. Some of it didn't work quite as well. Somebody said, weren't your leaders confused? I said, no, because they only used one strategy to start their group. The only potential for confusion was me, and nobody really cared about that. So, it's like fishing. I mean, different hooks, different bait, will attract different fish. And so we're going to do that. All right, so I'll close this with an anecdote. This is by way of, it's Peter Drucker by way of Bob Logan by way of Carl George. And they said this, which is better, half a loaf of bread or half of a baby? And everybody's puzzled at that point, what do you mean? And they said this, they said, if you're going to have a baby, you want to have a perfect baby. And I had a baby, our first baby had some special needs. So when you have a baby, you want a perfect baby. And he's a great kid. And half a baby won't do, which is kind of morbid to think about. But he said, if you're hungry, you don't need a perfect whole loaf of bread. If you're hungry, half a loaf of bread will do. And so what we have to decide when we look at small groups, when we look at leader development, when we look at discipleship, is this like a baby that needs to be perfect, or is this like a loaf of bread that needs to be available to someone who's starving? So I'll let you guys ponder that, and I'll close the webinar with that thought. So thank you for joining me today. If you have any other questions, you can reach out to me. I'm at alan@alanwhite.org. And so I just had a question. Yes, Frank, I will share the presentation. I recorded it, so I'll put up the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides. And I will also give you the link where you can set up a day and time for the free consultation I promised for sticking with me to the end here. So I'll be more than happy to do that for you. So thank you very much for being a part of this, and looking forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Alan, for sharing.